Hello and welcome. I'm a sociology guy. I'm an experienced sociology teacher and examiner. Today is June the 2nd. It is a Saturday evening. And of course, like as most sociology teachers do, I've decided to talk about methods in context. Just a quick disclaimer, even though I do work for one of the major exam boards, I have no prior knowledge of what is on the A-level exams this year. The question I'm going to look at today is part of an existing AQA exam, and the essay structure that I am setting out is just one way of answering the question. Other approaches may still score full marks. By no means is this a definitive answer, but I would like to think that this answer would get close to the top band. So here's the question. It's about investigating streaming using unstructured interviews. The item is an AQA item. Streaming involves teachers differentiating between pupils on the basis of their perceived ability, placing pupils whom they believe to be of similar overall ability in the same teaching group. This may result in working class pupils and those from certain ethnic minorities being placed in lower streams. Lower stream pupils may lose self-esteem, give up trying, or even join an anti-school subculture. By contrast, higher stream pupils may identify strongly with the school's values and goals. One way of studying streaming is to use unstructured interviews. These are often effective in exploring interviewees' personal feelings about sensitive subjects. However, for a variety of reasons, some pupils and teachers may refuse to participate in an unstructured interview. Apply material from item C and your knowledge of research methods. Evaluate the strengths and limitations of using unstructured interviews to investigate streaming. Okay, that's the question. Now, this is one of the hardest types of question for both students and teachers. For me, what tends to happen is that students will focus on one of two aspects of this question. First of all, those who tend to get the lower grades focus on the bit where it says evaluate the strengths and limitations of using unstructured interviews, and they ignore everything else. So what we have is we have a very list-like response which gives us one strength of an unstructured interview is that it is incredibly flexible. Another strength is that it is preferred by interpretivist sociologists because it gives us qualitative data. That's not engaging with the STEM. It's not engaging with the item. It's not answering the question. And those type of responses usually get limited to around about 12 out of 20. We don't see them go further beyond that if they've not mentioned anything about the strengths and limitations of using unstructured interviews to investigate the topic, the context, streaming. The other type of essay we get is the students who focus solely on streaming, and they will focus on some of the issues with streaming. And what tends to happen is they accidentally bring in unstructured interviews, and as a consequence they score higher than those who talk just specifically about unstructured interviews. When I'm tackling this type of question, the first thing I would look to do is highlight some of the key concepts in this item. This item is there to give you hints. Somebody is sitting in a room somewhere writing these items. They are pressing a little button that generates this item and a question, and what happens is the item is there for a purpose. It is not just there to introduce the question, it is there to give you clues. As you can see here, I've highlighted some of the things that you may want to talk about in your response just from looking at the item, and there is actually more yellow highlighted on that screen than there is white. There are so many clues in these type of items. If we look first of all, differentiating between pupils on the basis of their perceived ability. That's a big hint that these kids have been labelled, and whether they have been labelled based on their social class background, on their ethnic background, on their gender. That is something that you might want to discuss in this type of response. Placing pupils who they believe to be of similar overall ability in the same teaching group. This may result in, and our next highlighted bit, working class pupils and those from certain ethnic minorities being placed in lower streams. This is another big hint. What you have to do is you have to think like a sociologist. Who are we investigating? how are we going to investigate it, and what is the topic we're investigating. Now here they've given you a hint that working class pupils will be one of the people that you're investigating, as will some groups of certain ethnic minorities. Now in a little minute I'm going to talk about the who, the how and the what, but this is important. Who are you investigating? Lower stream pupils may lose self-esteem. What does this mean? How are we going to deal with students with low self-esteem through unstructured interviews? They may give up trying or even join an anti-school subculture. If they joined an anti-school subculture, what is their reaction going to be to somebody coming in and asking them about their education? By contrast, higher stream pupils may identify strongly with the school's values and goals. Hint here at maybe middle class students, females, at Chinese and Indian students. So what we have to look at here is how will interviewing them be different than interviewing those from a working class background? And we can use that information in our essay. The second part, one way of studying streaming is to use unstructured interviews. Okay, that's the how we're going to do this. Interviewees' personal feelings about sensitive subjects. There is another strong hint. We've already mentioned low self-esteem. If somebody has low self-esteem, it becomes a sensitive topic. And we know that unstructured interviews are really useful for dealing with sensitive subjects. However, for a variety of reasons, some pupils and teachers may refuse to participate in an unstructured interview. This is hinting at you to elaborate on why this is the case. Now, if I was to go into this exam, what I would look to do is I would look to tackle the how are we investigating the issue, who are we investigating, and what are we investigating. And I've just drawn up a few things that we can draw from this item and from this question that we might want to discuss. So who? Well, who are we investigating? There is two broad groups here that we're going to investigate. One could be teachers. We've hinted at that in the item that teachers might not attend. Why might they not attend? Well, the implication that, you know, if they're labeling students negatively, that could have a knock-on effect on their career. Another issue for teachers, they have a similar status to the researcher. What does this mean? You know, does it mean that they are going to give us socially desirable answers? Does it mean that they could potentially try and use impression management? Do teachers know that they are labeling their students? Are teachers aware of their own expectations of their students? These are some of the questions you might want to address. For students, middle class students are more likely to be in the top set. So when we interview them, they're going to be more pro-school. Ethnic minority groups, boys, the working class, they are more likely to be in lower sets. And what we all also know about them from our study of sociology is that they are more likely to be in anti-school subcultures. Well, what are we investigating? Well, we know that we're investigating setting and streaming. What we have to look at is how can this influence a student's experience. So being set and stream, it can have a major impact on your self-esteem. If you're put in the top set, you're going to feel confident. If you're put in the bottom set, you're going to start questioning your own intelligence. How might it impact on the performance? We know from studies from people like Keddy that they may not get the same opportunities if you're in the lower sets and streams than if you're in the higher sets and streams. How will this impact on their attitudes to school? We could look at differentiation and polarization, Lacey's Hightown grammar. Their willingness to cooperate. Is there going to be a clash between authority figures? If we're talking about the lower sets and streams, are the head teachers going to allow permission because of the negative publicity? What will happen if we find that working class kids are being negatively streamed, or if ethnic minority kids are being negatively streamed? Who's going to select the sample? This is another question that we've got to come into account. We've got to bring forward. Many of the schools will put forward their best kids, who will talk about how wonderful the school is and how setting and streaming is great and wonderful. So there could be a sample bias there. And then we look finally at sort of like how we're going to investigate it. So we start to look at the strengths and limitations of unstructured interviews. They're very useful for probing in-depth responses. You know, we can ask students, why do they think they're in the bottom set? If they give us a few clues, we may be able to ask follow-up questions. You can develop a rapport with students to try and get some responses through an unstructured interview. But they can also be subjective. You know, the researcher can make inferences based upon what the students have said. There is a certain amount of interviewer bias. You know, the teachers might give the responses that they're expecting the interview they are expecting the interviewer wants to hear, and also impression management. This can lead to teachers giving false information because of the implications on their career. Now, this is very likely in unstructured interviews, particularly between two people of the same status. So this is where methods in context actually gets really, really quite complicated for some people. It gets complicated for examiners, it gets complicated for teachers, it gets complicated for students, because the way that it's scored is in bands. Band 1 is just general bog standard information about education. This is a statement like setting in streaming is when students are placed into a certain group based on their academic ability. That is a band 1 response. It's not really talking about the who, it's not talking about the what we're investigating, it's not even linked into research, it's just a statement. Band 2 is when you mention a strength or limitation of the method, but you don't elaborate on it. Now, this could be that unstructured interviews have high validity. Great, you're right, they do have high validity, but why? You've got to explain that why. A band 2 response would just be a statement. Unstructured interviews can be time consuming. Okay, why? Then we get to band 3. Now, band 3, we can talk about the who. So we might talk about the problems with researching students. We might talk about the problems with researching teachers. Another type of band 3 response is we talk about the what. So we might talk about some of the problems with investigating streaming. So we might say, because the students have low self-esteem, they may not want to take part. Yeah, great. Okay, that's a good response, but it's not talking about the method, and it's not talking about the specific groups of students. And then there's the how, and this is what I said before about these essays tend to get 12 out of 20. This is where people will go, a limitation of unstructured interviews is that they can go off the point because there is no interview schedule. That would be a band 3 response. It's not talking about education, it's not talking about the specific issue, and it's not talking about the specific group that are being studied. It's just talking about research methods. Where the higher marks come in is when you hit 2 out of 3 of these. So you could suggest, for example, if we look at the who and the what, we could say working class kids are more likely to be negatively streamed. They have low self-esteem, and this may cause problems for the researcher in getting access to, in those students agreeing to take part. Okay, that's a band 4 response. An example of who and how, we could suggest that sort of like middle class students may see a status difference between themselves. Working class students may see a status difference between themselves and a middle class researcher. That is a band 4 response. Or the what and the how. So the fact that we're investigating a sensitive topic like streaming, we could say a researcher would be able to probe a little bit deeper in a more sensitive way to talk about a topic where people have low self-esteem. So that'd be a band 4 response. A band 5 response ticks all of the boxes. It gives us a strength and limitation of the method. It tells us who we are investigating and a characteristic of the person we're investigating. And it tells us about the topic we're investigating. So this could be something like students who have been streamed and placed in the lower sets and streams may have a negative attitude towards schools. These are more likely to be working class, and working class tend to have a different attitude towards authority. Therefore, the interviewer may need to develop a rapport with the student in order to be able to elicit responses. That is a band 5 response. You've ticked all 3 boxes. It is quite complex. What I suggest to my students is when you focus on 2 out of 3, inevitably what will happen is you will get the 3 out of 3s by default, if you like. What will happen is you will be thinking so much about the people that you're investigating and the topic that you're investigating that you will automatically fall into talking about the positives and negatives of using that method. It is quite complex. So I'm going to show you an essay that I've written on this topic to explain how I go about it. Now, I tend to start with an introduction. My introduction, there are different schools of thought about doing introductions in essays. Me personally, I suggest that they are useful. I think they're very useful because what you do is you put into the mind of the examiner that you know what you're talking about. There is a little bit of psychology involved in the fact that if you can present your argument in a very logical fashion by introducing some of the key concepts early on, introducing some of the theoretical ideas early on, that examiner starts to think this kid knows what they're talking about. So even though we've been talking about band 4 and band 5, I think a good introduction ticks all the boxes for band 3. So I've put 2 band 3 comments there. One in green at the top: unstructured interviews are a method that are preferred by interpretivist sociologists as they provide the researcher with the opportunity to gain valuable in-depth information about a person's experiences or opinions on a topic. What that is saying to the examiner is, I know what an unstructured interview is, and I know who would use it, and I know why they would use it. It may only be a band 3 response, but already the examiner has a very, very positive view of me as a student. The second point I'm making in the blue: unstructured interviews do not consist of a strict interview schedule. Rather, they are 1 or 2 thematic questions that allow the researcher to respond to the interviewee and probe deeper than other, more structured methods, giving the researcher insight into their experience of a stay-in. As such, they are useful for investigating a wide range of sensitive topics. Again, it is a band 3 response, but it shows that I really understand what an unstructured interview is. It is setting me up for that examiner to take one look at my paper and go, this student is going to get a good grade. It is all a little bit of psychology, a little bit of kidology, but you know, if it works and you get a good grade by doing it, great. If you want to just start with your first point, there is nothing wrong with that. Some will argue that this won't give you any extra marks. For me, it is all about the psychology of putting yourself forward as an A or an A-star candidate. Okay, from that I would go into the main body. My first paragraph: one strength, so already I'm highlighting that there's a strength of an unstructured interview, is that of unstructured interviews, to investigate setting and streaming. I'm staying focused on the what are we studying. We'll be gaining insight into how being placed into sets and streams influences the pupil's perception of themselves. As many students, particularly those in the lower sets and streams, will have been judged to be less academically intelligent than their peers, it will be useful for the researcher to be able to probe deeply and ask these students how it impacted on their attitudes towards school, their work ethic, and their self-esteem. This would require the interviewer to build up a rapport with those being interviewed, a considerable strength of unstructured interviews. So if we look at that paragraph and the bits I've highlighted in yellow, I'm talking about the who, the students, those in the lower sets and streams. I'm talking about them being judged less academically intelligent than their peers. I'm talking about the topic. I'm saying that sort of like, you know, it influences perceptions of themselves, and I'm talking about the how. It gives us an insight. It can develop a rapport, and I've used those terms strength a couple of times as well. For me, as an examiner, I would look at that and say that ticks all 3 boxes and is a band 5 response. Similarly, the second part from where it says a problem with using this method would be that many of the students in the lower sets and streams would be from a working class or Afro-Caribbean background, and being interviewed by an authority figure such as a middle-class researcher may result in less information being given due to status differences. Labov found this in his research where young black males were less likely to elaborate on their responses to a white researcher. Okay, this is probably what I would see as being a weak band 5. Maybe some would argue a band 4. I've marked it as a band 5 here, just for those purposes. A problem with using the method. There's my how, right? Sorry, problem with using the method, status differences, how. I've talked about the who, right? Working class or Afro-Caribbean background, and the fact that they are less likely to respond to an authority figure, right? So there's my who and there's my how, and I have mentioned that those groups are more likely to be in the lower sets and streams. I could see some examiners arguing that it is a band 4. Me personally, I would give it as a band 5 because they've taken from the item and they've seen that those in the lower sets and streams are from a working class Afro-Caribbean background. Okay, paragraph 2. What I think is another band 5 response. A further problem with the use of unstructured interviews would be how the researcher would gain access to potential interviewees. Access could be limited by a gatekeeper, either a head teacher or the student's parents. In the case of potentially damaging topics such as setting or streaming, particularly if the students have been labelled negatively on ethnicity, the head teacher may refuse permission to interview the students as it might impact negatively on the school. Now, I've marked this as a band 5. I can see the argument for it being a band 4 because there is nothing specific about unstructured interviews there. Really what we're talking about here is a problem with researching this topic with this group, and it's not specific enough to unstructured interviews. However, using terms like potential interviewees could see it move to a weak band 5. The second point, however, the ability of the interviewer to develop a rapport with these parents, that's the how, that's also the who, could enable them to explain the purposes of the interview and convince access to be granted so the student's voice can be heard. Now that's a band 4. There's no mention of streaming there. If you take the entire paragraph together as one and you marked it as one paragraph, it could be a band 5 response. But nevertheless, that is a good, strong paragraph that is going to get you towards an A grade. Paragraph 3, again, a band 4 and a band 5 in here. We would probably mark the one paragraph as a band 5, but we'll look at the 2 points separately. It can be assumed that teachers would be of a similar status to the researcher. Okay, there's the who, and a teacher's ability to impression manage could influence the validity, the how, of the interview in a number of ways. Teachers would be less likely to disclose that students have been placed into lower sets based on physical or social characteristics. There's the what, because of the potential implications for their career. So I've talked about status differences. That is something that is specific to interviews. I've talked about the who are we studying, teachers and the implications for their career. And I've talked about the topic, being placed into lower sets, potentially based upon physical or social characteristics. So that's a band 5. Furthermore, given the similar status with the interviewer, teachers are more likely to respond in a socially desirable manner, thus further influencing the validity of the interview. Now, the second point, if it's taken separately, will be a band 4 because there's no mention of the topic, but it is of the person who's being interviewed and of the method. If you took that paragraph as 1, I would award it as a band 5 because it's hit the who, the what, and the how. Paragraph 4, again, 2 points. The first one a little bit weaker than the second. Another limitation of using unstructured interviews to investigate setting and streaming would be that if consent was given, the gatekeeper may select students that would speak positively about the policy of setting and streaming. Okay, Children from pro-school subcultures, usually middle class, would not only extol the virtues of the school, but would see the absence of lower ability students in their classes as a positive thing. Okay, there's definitely in there discussion of the who and the what we are studying. There is a potential weak link in terms of unstructured interviews there, where we say that the students would speak positively. Some examiners might award that as being an aspect of an interview. For me, I wouldn't, right? I don't think it is a specific strength or limitation of an unstructured interview that they're speaking. This is more about research in itself, so it gets a band 4. However, a skilled interviewer utilizing the flexibility of an unstructured interview, there is your how, may be able to probe a little deeper with these students and find out why they were placed in the top sets and streams, the what, through asking a range of questions about their test scores, attitudes towards teachers and social backgrounds. That is the who. So that would become a band 5 response. The final paragraph of the main body, a further strength of using unstructured interviews to investigate setting and streaming would be the ability of the researcher to show empathy and direct the conversation in a way that avoids any psychological harm, which would be particularly useful given the potentially sensitive nature of dealing with students who had been labelled as less gifted from an early age. Okay, empathy and directing the conversation, that's part of your how. It's a strength. Okay, the topic, potentially sensitive nature. Avoids any psychological harm. Potentially sensitive nature of dealing with students who've been labelled as less gifted. That is your what. And also, we've got these students, the potential for psychological harm. So I would see that as being a band 5. The researcher's interpersonal skills would enable students from lower sets and streams to expand upon their experiences in a safe environment away from their peers and teachers. Okay, that is another point that we could add. However, the interviewer could be accused of leading the students into giving responses. So this idea of leading questions is a negative of the how that suit the purpose of his research, such as stating that anti-school attitudes had stemmed from the way they were treated by teachers. For me, that would be a band 5 in there. And to summarise, again, I think it's good practice to use a conclusion, particularly when you're looking at 30 mark and 20 mark questions. You need a conclusion to get into that top band. In conclusion, there are many positives to using an unstructured interview to investigate the topic of setting and streaming. The flexibility of the questioning and the potential for the interviewer to be able to probe deeper by using open questions and following them up could provide rich qualitative data on what is a complex topic. Okay, that is just recycled from the rest of the essay. It's what we would see as being a summative conclusion. The second part, however, does introduce something slightly new. Much of the success of unstructured interviews, particularly for topics that are viewed negatively, such as setting and streaming, is reliant upon the skills of the individual interviewer, not only to gain access to the students and teachers in the first place, but also to be able to elicit responses from students who may or may not understand the real reasons they have been put into sets and streams. I see that as being a band 4 response at the bottom there. Some might not give it credit because we have talked about individual interviewer skills. I would probably mark that as separate because it's different to what we were talking about in terms of empathy. We're talking about an interviewer needing skills, an interviewer needing training in order to do that. Okay, so that's that. I mean, what I've looked at today is not a brand new question like I do with some of my other videos. For me, it's very, very difficult, absolutely almost impossible to predict what type of question is going to come up on a methods in context. But the one thing I have noticed as a trend is they like to use existing pieces of research as the basis. So, for example, if you look at the third one down, field experiments and labelling was last year's question. It was using field experiments to investigate labelling in schools. That is based on Rosenthal and Jacobson's study Pygmalion in the Classroom. I have seen other questions in the past who talked about group interviews and anti-school subcultures. Obviously, Paul Willis's Learning to Labour. Unstructured interviews and parental choice. Gowitz. Semi-structured interviews and teacher attitudes. Howard Becker's The Ideal Pupil. Looking at, I think the AS question this year was official statistics and school performance, which is essentially leading to league tables. And non-participant observations and teachers' attitudes. This is Keddy's study into the information that students have. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it helps you out. There are 3 days to the first exam, and hopefully for some of you, you will never have to answer a methods in context question again, and that will be brilliant because it is one of the most difficult types. And hopefully for me, as a sociology teacher, I will be spending a Saturday evening sitting here discussing methods in context while my wife is next door watching Grey's Anatomy and my kids are upstairs asleep. But thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.